Multilinguals. What is your "they didn't realize I spoke their language" story? I'm a cable technician, and since I'm a white guy, most people don't expect that I can speak and write Spanish. This means I can often go unnoticed and just do my job without others realizing I can understand them completely. Sometimes I choose to let people know subtly that I can understand Spanish. One time I was doing an installation at a house where the family only spoke Spanish, and the order requested a Spanish-speaking technician. When I arrived at the door, the husband opened it and immediately assumed I couldn't speak Spanish because my appearance didn't match his expectations. His English was almost perfect, and he greeted me, showed me around, and pointed out where he wanted everything to be done. He let me work while he went into another room where his friend was, and they started talking badly about me. The husband said things like, "I can't believe they sent a white guy who doesn't speak Spanish. I specifically asked for someone who speaks Spanish so I wouldn't have to deal with this nonsense. He's probably going to be lazy and do a terrible job. I bet he'll still expect a tip after messing everything up, and I'll have to fix it myself." He kept complaining the whole time I was there, thinking I couldn't understand a word he was saying. When I finished the installation, I was pretty upset, but I didn't show it. The husband thought it was funny to insult me to my face, smiling as if he wasn't saying anything about me. So I looked at him and told him in Spanish, "Your installation is complete. If you have any questions, you can call the company and they'll find someone who speaks Spanish to assist you." He was shocked when I spoke to him in Spanish, and I continued, "Next time, you should ask if the person can speak Spanish before you start talking badly about them." His friend couldn't stop laughing as I left the customer standing there, feeling stupid. I hope he savored that moment like he deserved to. I bet that experience left the customer a valuable lesson. Story 2. My mom's a linguist and speaks about 15 languages fluently, and as such, I picked up a couple along the way. Most of my childhood was spent in Germany, so I have a firm grasp of the language, which doesn't really seem to match my appearance. I'm a 6'3", 220-pound black man who speaks German. Now, this isn't too uncommon a sight in Germany, but in North America, I'm a rare unicorn. So I was standing at the bus stop one day in the heart of downtown Toronto, and there was these two old German ladies who were not having a good time. They were trying to find the art gallery and were fed up with the fact that they were having such a bad time navigating because their English-speaking children had left them alone for the day. I didn't have anything particularly important planned for that day, so I turned to them and said something to the effect of, "You know, our city has a lot to offer if you know where to look. Would you two like me to show you where the gallery is? And a couple places you can get lunch along the way." They were shocked. They were so happy that they found someone who spoke German and couldn't stop taking pictures with me to show their family the guy that saved their day. I walked them to the gallery and gave them a bit of an impromptu walking or bus tour along the way. That was the day I gained 2 almas. Story 3. I once interviewed for a part-time school holiday job, together with a good friend of mine. My friend is Chinese, the majority race of the country I live in. I, however, am quite clearly not. The first thing the HR manager says when he sees me is, "We need someone who speaks Mandarin," a criteria not stated anywhere in the employment ad, and which subtly translates to Chinese candidates preferred. My friend, while ethically Chinese, speaks little to no Mandarin. I, on the other hand, speak it rather fluently. Probably as a test, the HR manager decides to field his questions in Mandarin, clearly intent on removing me out of the interview. My friend turns pale. As he stumbles along to answer the question posed in whatever halting Mandarin he can scrape together, the manager then turns to me, rather arrogantly, waiting for my reply. It gave me a great joy to tell him straight to his face, "Thank you for the opportunity, but clearly I am not the right candidate you're looking for to fill this position since I'm not Chinese." In crisp, fluent Mandarin, the look on his face was priceless. Story 4. My family and I were on a long flight from Houston to Greece to visit our relatives. On the same flight, there were 2 groups. A group of student ambassadors, mostly girls from middle and high schools in the U.S., and a youth male Greek soccer team. Unfortunately, they were all seated near us, while their chaperones were at the other end of the plane. The boys from the soccer team were very interested in the American girls, who were about 2 to 4 years younger than them. They were flirting and being very touchy-feely. They even changed seats to sit with the girls, and they were so loud and annoying that the whole plane was upset with them. The flight crew didn't seem to do anything about it, which made the situation even worse. The boys were also talking among themselves in Greek. My mother speaks Greek fluently because she went to Greek school for many years and spent her summers growing up in the hills of the Peloponnese in Greece. While my family and I were trying to read, sleep, or watch the small TV at the front of the plane, we had to listen to these kids constantly talking. At one point, my mother couldn't take it anymore. She stood up and walked over to the group of boys and said, "These boys are calling names. They also think American girls are very easy to impress, by the way." She She pointed at the boy who was the most straightforward with one of the girls. Is older. They all have girlfriends waiting for them at the airport. Now please be quiet so I can sleep. After my mother's intervention, the boys quickly went back to their original seats and went silent for the rest of the flight. It was the best flight ever after that. I really love my mom. Talking bad to someone in Greek on a flight going to Greece? That's one way to get caught. Story 5. In 2010, I was at the Hmong New Year celebration in St. Paul or Minneapolis with my family. This event is huge, and there used to be thousands of Hmong people there. It's a time when we celebrate our heritage. I'm Hmong, which is a group from Southeast Asia, but I look like I could be Hispanic. Anyway, I needed to use the bathroom because, well, I'm only human. After I finished washing my hands, 2 older guys, probably in their 30s or 40s, came in. As soon as they saw me, they started talking in Hmong, saying things like, "These Mexicans think they can just come to our New Year. Maybe we should call the police to take him back to Mexico." Luckily, my cousin walked in at that moment, so I spoke to him in Hmong. I asked, "Hey, where did you guys go? The last time I saw you was at the ball tossing area." This is a strange courting activity where people throw a tennis ball or softball back and forth while flirting. After our brief chat, I made sure to give those 2 men the most disapproving look I could muster as I left the bathroom. It worked perfectly. You could tell by their faces that they knew they had made a mistake. Story 6. I'm Brazilian and was flying to Rio from Atlanta. There were these 2 very attractive girls with their mother speaking English very fluently, and one of them had their seat right next to mine. We exchanged some courtesy in English, as I just assumed they were American, and so did they. They were Brazilian Americans, and so did not have an accent, and I started speaking English from a young age, so as long as I don't talk too much, I can go unnoticed. So they start putting their carry-on luggage in the bin overhead, and the mother says to her daughters, in Portuguese, "Poor thing, he thinks to let one of you sit next to him." So I just turn to her and say, in Portuguese, "Don't worry, ma'am, I'm just being polite. I do have a girlfriend, and it'll be a pleasure to share this flight with you." She just went, "Oh," and then she sat there in silence for the whole flight. Story 7. I recently went to Japan for my first ever international trip and was totally prepared to have to struggle through all my day-to-day interactions in Japanese, but was surprised at how widespread even a basic understanding of English is over there. Everyone assumes you won't speak any Japanese at all, so they stick to as much English as they're comfortable with, or you basically just play charades. At a restaurant in Kobe, the waitress was practically fluent in English, so we chatted a while and it came up that I'm studying Japanese. So I had a little small talk and she was impressed. Then the owner came over to talk but wasn't as confident in his English, so we had the waitress translate. He was asking all these questions about where we'd been so far, where we were staying, how we liked everything, if we'd been down to Kobe port yet, etc. It was simple enough that I understood 100% without her translation, and the waitress could tell. Finally, she says to him, in Japanese, "By the way, he understands what you're saying." His eyes practically bugged out of his head, and he got super excited and asked if we wouldn't mind waiting 30 minutes for him to close up and send everyone home. So, I wait, he closes everything up, and we all end up hanging out that night. He drove us around the city, bought us drinks, even drove back to the Airbnb. Japan is amazing. Story 8. I'm from the US, and when I was a kid, my family went to France for a couple weeks. My dad was a very smart man. He graduated college at a young age and had a love for languages. He was fluent in French, Spanish, and German, and he lived in France for a year or 2. He came back to the US and taught French for a few years before getting his JD and PharmD. He was constantly trying to teach us French whenever he could when we were little. He kept in touch with his French professor from college, and when we were in France, we stayed with him in Saint-Hilaire-de-Riez. They had a small party with some of their friends, and everyone sat around talking and drinking. As much as he tried to teach us French, we could only do as much as ordering food and reading restaurant menus and such. So everyone was talking in English except for one man's wife that was there and didn't speak English. The hosts were translating most things for her. At one point, the man says something in French like, "Americans don't value things like learning foreign languages." Not knowing my dad spoke French, my dad looks at him and in French replies something along the lines of, "You're right. Lots of Americans aren't introduced to foreign languages until they're older and already out of the prime time of their life to start learning." And that this was why he started teaching his kids French as early as possible, and even why he brought his kids to France, hoping that we'd gain an appreciation for another language and culture. I didn't know what the guy had said or what my dad had said until after we left, but I remember the look on the guy's face and how he was clearly apologizing repeatedly. The host laughed too and explained my dad's history with French and his education. To say the man was embarrassed would be an understatement. Friday will be 13 years since my dad passed away at 55 years old. He was such an awesome person and loved by everyone he met. He would never take offense to something even like that guy. He was from a tiny southern town in the middle of nowhere and grew up with nothing, and worked to get where he was in life. Story 9. Flemish guy here, working as a safari guide in the Kruger area of South Africa. One time, my boss asked me to go pick a family of 4 up at the Glossery Reserve Gate, do an afternoon game drive with them, and drop them off again afterwards. This was very common. Normally, we only do game drives with people that book a room in our own lodge in the reserve. So I picked them up, introduced myself, and go over the rules, all in English. They reply in English, or at least the dad does, and normally I can pick up straight away if it's someone from France, Belgium, Holland, or Germany. But his English was Oxford English, so I thought, English people. Off we went. 10 minutes into the game drive, I hear them speak in Flemish, and not only that, in my own dialect. Side note, every Flemish town has a dialect. We can hear what region or province other Flemish people are from, and if from the same region, we can often even pinpoint the exact little town or community they're from. Ooh, I was going to have fun with these folks. Found a few nice animal sightings, spoke English all the time, but then one sentence to the next, switched to their exact dialect. I thought, now they're going to be surprised. But nope, we all kept chatting in Flemish now. Only 20 minutes later, the daughter goes, "Wait a minute, he speaks Flemish." After everyone had a good laugh, I asked them where they were from. They literally lived 1 street away from me. It's a small world, folks. Story 10. My friend and I were sharing a cab with 2 girls we didn't know. We decided to share the taxi with them because it was a long ride and we wanted to save some money. They started talking in Swedish, not realizing that my friend is also a Finnish Swede. Swedish is her mother tongue. She went to a Swedish school, but she's Finnish and speaks Finnish very well. I understand Swedish, but I was too hammered to pay attention. Suddenly, my friend texted me. They're planning to leave us with a bill. I texted back that we should tell the driver, so my friend just said to him, "These girls will pay half of this before they leave." The driver got the hint and didn't open the doors until they paid their share. Another time I was at an airport with my aunt. She had injured her leg, but since we were going on a beach holiday, we decided not to cancel our trip. My aunt has lived in Germany and speaks German fluently. I've also lived there, so I understand it well, but I'm not fluent. We were speaking Finnish, just chatting to pass the time, when a flight attendant asked us to board the plane first. This middle-aged man turned to his wife and said in German, "I don't think disabled people should be allowed on planes." My aunt asked me to stop. I was pushing a wheelchair. Then she turned to the man and said in perfect German, "I'm sorry, sir, but I injured my leg and didn't want to cancel my holiday plans. You're being incredibly offensive towards handicapped people, and I feel sorry for your wife. Have a nice flight." The man turned red and couldn't say anything to us. He just looked away. His wife looked absolutely scared. Story 11. Not me, but my stepmother. She grew up in Japan and speaks fluent Japanese. She looks Italian and white. She's an olive skin tone, and since she's only a quarter Japanese, she doesn't look like she's from any East Asian-speaking country. One day, she and some friends went to get their nails, both hands and feet, done at a salon for some girl time. The ladies who were doing the work were speaking fluent Japanese and were mostly gossiping about men and other things until they got to the foot of said procedure. My stepmother's friend is a little chubby and she doesn't have runway model style of feet, while the ladies who work at the salon are just starting to make fun of her in Japanese, laughing and giggling, enjoying themselves in someone else's misfortune and looks. My stepmother said she let this go on for too long. It was about 5 minutes of them talking badly before my stepmother replied in Japanese. Her comment to them, "I didn't realize that we needed to look like princesses to get service here." Something along those lines. The ladies stopped and looked at my stepmother with extreme guilt. They apologized in English and were silent the remainder of the time my stepmother and her friends were there. Story 12. I'm half Chinese, quarter English, quarter Irish, and was born and raised in London. I don't look particularly British, or indeed Chinese, but I definitely look foreign. In the wake of Brexit, I happened to be on the phone to my mother, Chinese, while on the train commuting into work, so I was speaking Mandarin. While on the phone to her, I overheard some guys grumbling about Chinese in this country, Brexit borders, immigrants, Muslims, Polish builders taking our jobs, stealing our benefits, blah, 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 or whatever. But then an offensive word came into it a couple times too. Clearly, this man had been emboldened by the vote to leave the EU and felt justified in airing his opinions, feeling there were lots of like-minded others. English very much being my first language, I turned to him and just said, "You said what, mate?" In my clearly from South London accent. At this point, he immediately started to backpedal and said I was all right because I was one of us, whatever that meant. So I got called out for being a foreigner in my own country, which is both amusing and sad. That was indeed sad. And what's more sad is I don't know if I did a good job doing a British accent there. Story 13. I was riding the metro in Montreal and my car was pretty quiet except for a family presumably on vacation from the States. They were having a very loud conversation in English about how they were a bit lost. The wife was demanding that the husband ask someone in the train for help, but he was refusing because he only knew a couple French words and no one would understand them. Little did they know that probably a third of Montrealers are Anglophone or Allophone, and that most of the Francophones in the metro that day would have at least understood a simple request for directions. Finally, the husband walks over to someone in the car to ask for help. Before he could get 2 words out, the person, who would have heard their entire previous conversation, responded in perfect English. The next stop is the one you want. The whole car snickered a little bit as the realization washed over the family that maybe people in Montreal speak a bit more English than they realized. Story 14. I went on a class trip to France my senior year of high school. We learned about and enjoyed French art, history, and culture, of course. But being teenagers, my friend Mitch and I were far more interested in the bare beaches we'd get to visit in Nice. So Mitch and I set ourselves up on the rocky beach one beautiful sunny day and awaited a parade of beautiful and bare French women. At first we were a bit disappointed. Apparently it was more popular with 80-year-old French women than we'd imagined. Eventually a young couple set a towel right next to us. As we listened into their conversation, we realized they're both Americans, and they're arguing. She wanted to go bare, he didn't want her to. I don't want a bunch of guys staring at you, he said. But everyone here is French, she argued. You'd probably stand out more by not looking like them. Now I was on the strip with other kids from French class, so Mitch and I both knew enough high school level French to get around. But that day, at that moment, we engaged in the most fluent and convincing French conversation of our young lives. No wide-eyed American teens here, just 2 sophisticated French guys enjoying the beach and interested in some amazing American girl. We were conjugating verbs like our lives depended on it. Eventually, the boyfriend got angry and left, and his girlfriend went to it. Mitch and I continued to play it cool, but this really did seem like the greatest thing that had ever happened ever. We talked about cheese and going to the library and whatever else our limited French vocabulary allowed us to talk about. Later that night, we both thanked our French teacher for the opportunity. She probably would have been disappointed to know what opportunity we exactly meant, but left it vague and everyone was happy. C'est la vie. Story 15. I speak a beginner's amount of French from taking it in university. When I was in Paris with my boyfriend, we were sitting at a restaurant called L'Os du Falafel. Like many European restaurants, the tables are in close quarters. My boyfriend and I are chatting away in English, and when our food arrived, we began taking pictures to send to his mom, because it is super delicious and the most beautiful plate I've ever laid eyes on. 2 older French ladies sitting next to us started side-eyeing us as we did this, though I couldn't fully understand them because I was only a beginner in French. They were laughing and clearly talking about us kids and our phones. Ils sont ridicules. Well, I don't know exactly what they were saying and wasn't offended at all. I still thought it would be funny if they thought I could understand. So at the next chance in our conversation, I said something in French to my boyfriend. I can't remember exactly what it was, very simple stuff, but in the past tense, which is basically as far as my education took me, to take them aback. It worked. They stopped talking instantly and looked a little shocked. Well, maybe they were shocked at how terrible it was. Anyways, if you're enjoying the video, don't forget to hit that subscribe and like button for more videos like this. Story 16. One language person here, but I've got a funny story. I worked with a group of Korean students when working on my degree. We worked in a catering kitchen. I used to listen to them talk all the time and would try and laugh when they laughed. They would notice and give me weird looks. One day they were building about 5,000 box lunches. I was working across from them on the hotline. One of them was placing bread, next was on protein, next was lettuce, tomato, and cheese. The guy who was placing the cheese ran out and went to go get more. He walked to the cheese cooler but couldn't find any cheddar. About a minute before he looked, I noticed a new hire grab the cheddar and return it to the meat cabinet. Now they all spoke Korean at work, but when he went to the one in charge, I knew he was asking where the cheddar was. She walked him over to the cheese cabinet and also found that it was gone. In English, I say, Miji, the cheddar is in the far cabinet next to the roast beef. Then I pretend that I'm not watching them. She walked to the meat cabinet, pulled out the cheese, and yelled to me, Do you speak Korean? No, I say. How did you know what he asked for? I don't know what you're talking about, Miji. After all of that, they would switch to English when I was in the kitchen. Story 17. Being Canadian, I speak English and French. Years ago, I was posted to Germany with the Canadian military. My friend came to visit me, and we booked a trip through a German travel agency to France. So we got onto a bus full of Germans, and off we went. When we arrived at the hotel in France, we were all lined up to check in. My friend and I were near the end of the line. As the line slowly progressed, the 2 French hotel staff members who were checking us in and speaking German to the tourists started speaking in a lower voice to one another, and they were bad-mouthing all of us tourists in French. I could hear speaking and understood every word. They were saying things about how Germans only drink certain beverages and eat sausages and do not appreciate fine French food and wine or culture. How Germans are loud and other non-complimentary things. My friend and I were smiling at each other listening to all of this. When we got to the front of the line, they asked, in German, for our passports. We handed them our Canadian passports and I asked them, in French, if they could recommend a good French restaurant that had a nice wine list. Oh, and could they also recommend a museum nearby? They looked at us. The girl turned red and then mumbled something about a restaurant around the corner and a museum a few streets over. I thanked them in French, took our key and left them standing there looking flustered. Story 18. Went to a taco shop with my significant other. This place had a menu that was half in Spanish and half in English. Only 2 people there could speak English. My significant other is Hispanic but doesn't speak Spanish. I'm Jewish, but I studied Spanish for 5 years and I'm quite good at it. We ordered our food to go and sat down to wait for it. We were close to the kitchen, so I could hear what the people inside were saying. My attention was caught when I heard the word gringa. I was the only white woman there, so I started listening closely. At full volume, I heard 2 women talking about how a nice Mexican boy shouldn't be dating a skinny white girl, and how it was embarrassing that we were together. By this time, we had been waiting for our food for about 25 minutes. I saw one of the women walking out, so I approached her and asked in Spanish if her to-go order would be ready soon. She looked really embarrassed. Like, if she had a tail, it would have been tucked between her legs. She said, very quietly, I'll go check, without looking me in the eye. I've never seen someone act so sheepish. The surprising part? They messed up our order. I went back and told them in Spanish that maybe if they spent less time talking about their customers and more time focusing on their orders, I wouldn't have had to wait so long for my food. And it still would have been wrong. It might have been petty, but it felt good to say it. I already deal with enough nonsense about being in a mixed-race couple from my own family. I don't need it from strangers. Story 19. Here's a story of how I found out a longtime friend of mine has a thing for me. I'm half Indonesian. I was born and lived there for quite some time before I moved to the States. I was on vacation in Jakarta this past summer, visiting family and catching up with old friends. I went out one night with an old friend I was extremely close with. Let's call her Y. We pretty much went on a date. I took her to the movies, had dinner, and we spent a good amount of time at the arcades. We linked up with our old circle afterwards. When I dropped her home, her mom was at the door. I got out of the car to greet her and show some respect. As soon as she sees me, she says, in English, "Hello, my name is X. I'm Y's mother. Did you guys have fun?" Afterwards, she starts whispering to her daughter. I was able to hear a bit of it and realized they were speaking conversational Bahasa. I overheard these lines. "Ini cowok yang kamu bilangnya, kailan sudah pacaran?" Which translates as, "Is this the boy you were talking about? Are you guys dating now?" Her daughter just blushes in embarrassment, hugs me and says goodnight to me as she assumes I'm about to leave. Before I leave, I say goodnight and I just let out this line, "Terima kasih, Ibu. Salamat malam. Semoga saya dan Ibu bisa ketemu lagi minggu depan sebelum saya balik ke Amerika." Which translates to, "Thank you, ma'am. Good night. Hope your daughter and I can meet up again next week before I have to head back to the States." She was shocked. She was extremely surprised and realized that I understood what she was saying to her daughter. Her daughter was just laughing at her. She calls me later that night on FaceTime saying her mom was still not over the fact that I'm fluent in Bahasa. She then confesses her feelings to me. Story 20. This didn't happen to me, but it happened to my multilingual cousin and his favorite story amongst the family. Said cousin, who speaks a multitude of languages, 6+ but not sure which, was visiting family in Australia and they all decided to venture out for a meal. After being seated at their table and getting their starters out of the way, my cousin picked up on the table next to them, making some very rude comments towards my family's table in German. Considering that the cousin had worked for many years as a translator between firms for German and English business operations, she politely turned towards the rude individuals and requested that they stop. Ashamed, they apologized profusely and even sent over a bottle of expensive drink to the table as an apology. Following the arrival of the bottle, there was a short pause where my family were able to carry on with their meal. However, the party of rude individuals could not contain themselves and were very much determined to continue to make comments, but this time in Spanish, even going so far as to make comments about how British people rarely speak more than 2 languages. Unfortunately for them, this was another language in which my cousin is fluent, and the scenario played out very much in the same way for them. You would think that at this point that perhaps they had learned their lesson and would stop trying to make snarky comments about my family gathering, especially considering the apologetic bottle and verbal apology. However, the routine had to play itself out for the 3rd time, in yet another language, before they would decide to pay for their meal and go elsewhere to complain about my family in peace. So sad that the offending party was apparently intelligent, being at least trilingual themselves and still condescending and rude to their family. Story 21. Last summer I was on vacation in Florence in a resort. A lot of different people from other European countries visited there as well. I myself am from the Netherlands, but the people I'm about to mention as a family were Belgium. I walked past the garden of their house, just coming from the pool. Back then my hair was blue. Now I had augmented my appearance, and the mother of the family mentioned in a rather loud voice how disgusted she is with people like me. The father agreed and said out loud that he would disown his kids, who were also present, if they do this kind of stuff because people like me are lowlives, up to no good, etc. The one of the kids, the son, told the dad that I could hear them, because I was looking at them by now with a bit of an angry look. The father assured them that I couldn't understand, so it's okay. Then the daughter said, "She's Dutch. She helped me get some ice cream yesterday and I talked with her." The parents then looked at me again and quickly turned away. And didn't dare to look at me each time I encountered them for the rest of the time I was there. Story 22. I'm a white guy that speaks Spanish. I was in line at a fast food restaurant once, and the workers behind the counter were all speaking Spanish. They were making fun of the guy in front of me. He was a bigger guy and he ordered a good amount of food. They were mocking him for being so chubby and eating at their place and all laughing and having a great time. When I got my food, I told one of the workers that I didn't think it was funny what they were saying about the guy. The look on her face was awesome. They had felt so protected in their little bubble that no gringos could ever possibly speak Spanish, and that had burst for her in that moment. I hope from then on each of those workers thought more about what they say in Spanish in public. It's not an uncommon language here in the US, and more people than you would think are speaking Spanish and learning it. Story 23. This is a story about my dad in a different country, with a military background. I was born and raised in Panama City, Panama. My mom is fully Panamanian and my dad is fully white, from Maryland, so they come from two very different backgrounds. Anyway, we were shopping in one of the big malls in Panama City. I was about 10 years old at the time. My dad took my little brother and me to go shopping. My dad was in the US Army then, and he had an old-fashioned mustache and was starting to lose his hair. He had blue eyes and blonde hair too. Back then, in 1994, the country still held some bitterness towards Americans and white people, so we went to a toy store because my dad wanted to buy some things. In Panama, if you show your passport, you don't have to pay the national tax. We went to the front desk and the item we wanted was $25, but the older woman working there said it was $50. She was clearly trying to cheat us and keep some extra money for herself. My dad asked in English. I thought it was $25. The woman said, "Yes, but there's tax and an import fee as well." My dad replied, "I have my passport. Doesn't that mean I don't have to pay the tax?" He's very old school and gentlemanly. The woman said, "Let me get the manager." The manager came over and they started talking in Spanish. I'll never forget what they said. "This is just another gringo who has come here to ruin our country. Charge him the $50 and don't give him the discount." My dad speaks Spanish, English, and German fluently because of his work in Army intelligence. He responded in Spanish with a smile. "That's fine. I'll buy my son's toy somewhere else. I don't need to be robbed by cowardly thieves. Have a nice day and may St. Mary bless you." They turned super red and just froze. My dad grabbed her hands and we laughed. My dad had a big, proud smile on his face. It was a really cool moment. Story 24. I'm American, but I'm fluent in Russian. One time while I was living in Russia, I had just gone off a flight at an airport in Moscow when I was approached by some taxi drivers. Judging by my American appearance, they were rattling off prices in English, and one persistent man convinced me to go ride with him. I only responded in English to him, and he was getting excited, thinking he caught another gullible foreigner. Once we got to his taxi, he told me his price, which was about 5 times more rubles than I would normally spend. Only then did I speak in Russian. I told him, "Are you insane? Do you think I've never ridden in a taxi here in Russia before? Good luck finding another customer." He blushed and panicked and offered me a ride for a third of the original offer. I just walked away and a nearby taxi driver who thought our exchange was comical offered me a much better fare. Story 25. My dad, Caucasian, had picked me up from the airport and took me to his friend's restaurant. At the restaurant, we sat with his friend and 2 female companions. We were all introduced over a round of drinks. During the small talk, the ladies decided to talk among themselves in their native language, Tagalog, Philippines language. They were bad-mouthing my dad and his friend and smiling in their faces. I said nothing but listened. At the end, my dad told them that I was mixed and that my mother is Filipino. They were oohing and ahhing until he said, "She's fluent in Tagalog." Their eyes widened and lips tightened. I said, "Oo, marunong ako mag-Tagalog. At naiintindihan ko lahat ng sinasabi niyo tungkol sa daddy at kaibigan niya. Mga malandi, suplada, hostess kayo. Translation: Yes, I know Tagalog, and I understood every word you said about my dad and his friend. You flirty women. Story 26. I am German and Irish, so I'm pale as a ghost. However, as a part of my major, I needed to learn the language, so I chose Spanish. Around Phoenix, there is no shortness of utilization. I can still read and a bit of translation, but speaking is a bit of a challenge since I really haven't used the ability for IT work in a while. I recently picked up a girlfriend who is half Mexican, but doesn't speak a word of Spanish. I've been talking to her mom in Spanish and rebuilding my vocabulary and slang, but I still struggle. The moral of this story comes from a trip to a local fast food joint. Girlfriend and I order our food and are waiting. A Mexican couple walks in and eyes me with a Mexican girl. The guy looks at his significant other and goes, in Spanish, "A white boy thinks he has a chance with a Mexican." I think that's what he said, but gringo and hermosa were said. I didn't flinch. We waited at the soda station. The woman came behind me and went, "Hurry up, white boy," under her breath. I snapped, turned to her and said, "Tu hermana no se quejó de mi velocidad anoche." AKA, your sister didn't complain about my speed last night. She just stood there and I walked away with a giant smirk. My girlfriend still hasn't a clue what I did. Story 27. A bit of background. I live in Australia. Look Asian but speak English without any accent. Can speak or understand Mandarin. But I'm not fluent, so I only speak it with my parents. I went to buy bubble tea at a shop that seemed to be staffed by Chinese people. You often get Chinese customers placing orders in Mandarin. So if you order in English, I guess they assume you don't speak Chinese. I placed my order in English. The cost was something like $12.40. So I handed over a $20 note and $2.40 in coins, expecting $10 back in change. The girl at the cash register took my money, gave me my receipt, and turned around to make bubble tea. I was expecting a $10 change. I waited for the girl to come back and give me change, but no. She just went on to serve the next customer and ignored me. When I finally caught her attention, I told her I was expecting change, but she told me that I only gave her a $10 note in coins. I knew for a fact that I gave her a $20 note because $20 notes are red, while $10 notes are blue, and because I have a habit of withdrawing $20 notes from the ATM. The girl went to talk to her supervisor or manager in Mandarin. They were standing near me and probably thought I couldn't understand them. The girl was telling her manager that she only got a $10 note and coins from me, and was adamant that she didn't do anything wrong. The manager then told her, in Mandarin, to just give me a $10 note to make me go away. The girl eventually gave me a $10 note but offered no apology. Being the shy, non-confrontational type, I didn't say anything or let on that I understood what they were saying. I got my bubble tea and $10 note, then left. Dude, I don't want to dog on you. I really don't. But that was the most anticlimactic story ever, man. Story 28. So after the long and grueling flight including connections from Miami to Athens, Greece, I arrived in my home country. While waiting at the carousel waiting for my luggage, I realized it would never come out of those black rubber flaps. Not the first or last time this would happen in a transatlantic flight for me, but I talked to the desk attendant who was designated for the job and found out I had 3 days in Athens before I'd get my luggage. I had 3 reasons for being in Greece. The first, a wedding. The second being a doctor's visit. The last being the beach. I wasn't going to buy another suit for wedding or swimming, so I just bought some cheap clothes intended for tourists decorated with "I love Athens" and Greek flags. I'm also a big fan of hats, so I bought one that matches my shirt, mainly because all the hats matched all the shirts. The next day, as I caught a cab to go to a clinic to get blood tests, I got a call from a friend back in the States. I had my headphones in and conversed as I handed the driver a Google Maps printout of the clinic's location. At some point in the drive, he must have assumed I was a tourist, as it did fit the bill, and he reached over to turn the meter off. I had an idea of what was going on but didn't say anything. As we stopped in front of the clinic, the gentleman turned around and spoke in broken English. "This will be €36. The trip was really worth about $7. I told my friend, "I'll call you back, I have to pay for this cab." As I put my phone away and looked up to the cabbie, I responded in perfect Greek, "Look here, I'm not going to get scammed of €30 for a walk that would have taken 5 minutes. I'm not paying for that." I promptly walked out the cab, into the clinic, and up the stairs. As you can imagine, this cabbie was not in the best of shape, so he couldn't follow so closely up the stairs. He barged into the waiting room full of elderly people and children. I was among them, reading as he began to scream at me, calling me a crook. I told the nurse who rushed into the room that we would need the police to come and test this man if he's intoxicated, and he quickly became silent. I stood up and walked over to the melon-shaped man and exclaimed, "People like you, who treat newcomers to our nation with such disrespect and thievery, are the reason they do not come back. You should be ashamed to treat people who leave their country and bring money into our economy like that. Get out of my sight." He waddled out of the clinic and found the elevator down. Story 29. I was visiting a friend who lives in Abu Dhabi. We decided to visit the Grand Mosque. As it's a religious place, you are required to cover up out of respect, which includes women covering their hair. Most tourists embrace it and are more than happy to follow the rules. While we were inside, one woman refused to keep her hair covered. The security guard told her to put it up or she'd have to leave. I'd heard her and her husband speaking outside and they were American. However, when the guard confronted her, she said to her husband in Italian, "Just pretend we don't understand English. I'm not covering my hair." And that's exactly how they responded. I was so mad about how disrespectful they were being. I marched over and said to the guard, "It would seem these Americans suddenly only speak Italian. Don't worry, I speak Italian so I can translate for you." He said, "Please ask her to cover her hair so she must leave immediately." I nodded and smiled, then turned to them and said in Italian, "I know you're American and understand exactly what he's saying. Stop behaving so disrespectfully and cover your hair. How dare you come here and behave this way? You should be ashamed." She said, "I'm a Christian. If I don't want to cover my hair, I shouldn't have to." To which I replied, "If being a devout Christian is so important to you, don't visit a mosque." As I said it, two older women walked past us and said in perfect Italian, "You're not even Italian. We are Italian. Now do as you're told and go back to your own country," and walked off. The woman in question covered her hair and I said to the guard, "Sorry, took a bit of explaining," and walked back to my friend. I watched her and her husband walk straight out of the mosque without stopping. Well, if you like these stories, here's more. YouTube thinks you're going to love this. Catch you in that video.